just like with Partimento, you don't know exactly what happens there, but you have to sort of read between the lines. And you don't have, in Partimento, you're given the bass, so the form is already predetermined, so to speak. But I feel that someone who has skill in Partimento, that is, they can play individual phrases. They know the basic schema for playing individual phrases, and they know a few rules. They can basically improvise a movement in sonata form. The basic rule is, and I'll put it in a nutshell, that each I'll focus on the exposition alone because that's complicated enough. You ultimately start the piece in the home key, and you're going to end the first part, that is the exposition, with a formal cadence that is a perfect authentic cadence that has formal impact, a formal cadence in the secondary key. And then each phrase will have a different resting point than the previous one. So you can't have two main resting points, as they call them, in a row that have the same, except in certain circumstances that were repeated. And each resting point would be, a successive resting point would be closer towards the perfect authentic cadence in the new key. Thus, for instance, let's say you start the piece, you start with a phrase that ends with a resting point that's supported by a 1 chord. The next resting point, you can't have it again on a 1 chord. It might be supported by a 5 chord. The next one by a resting point on 5/5, and then finally with a resting point on a cadence in the key of 5. And thus you can see each resting point is different than the previous one, and yet inching closer to the perfect authentic cadence in the new key. Okay. And if you like, I can give an example of this.
Yes, please.
So I hit a resting point on 1. Next phrase, I'm going to hit a resting point on 5. Next phrase, I'll hit a resting point on 5/5. The last phrase, I'll hit a cadence in the key of 5. Now you notice each phrase, you probably noticed the standard schema, such as Robert Yertigan talks about. And each time I organize the phrase in that piece, I use one of the standard schema that I learned from playing Partimenti that someone at the time would have had under their fingers. As far as organizing the phrase, as far as the tonal order, to use Riepel's term, I had that very simple formula. Each phrase ended on a different main resting point, and each time it inched closer towards, and thereby led towards the perfect authentic cadence in the new key. And that was obviously a very simple piece where each phrase was 4 bars long. The phrases could have been stretched out. Each phrase could have had an appendix. Each phrase could have been repeated exactly or echoed, so that, and through such means, this basic scaffold, such as I just played, could be expanded so that you could have multiple phrases leading to a single main resting point.
It was beautiful. And you mentioned a term, resting points. Now, according to your research, is it correct to say that the 18th century conception of form related more to this idea of resting points rather than the formal areas, key centers, or containers you were talking about earlier?
Yes, they did not think in terms of key areas, or at least not. They didn't have that term. They might describe things that we could say, well, that's sort of what we would call a key area. For instance, Georg Vogler was trying to describe one phrase, and he says it starts and ends on the same tone. You'd say, why don't you just say it's in the tonic key area? Because he didn't have that word. This is how he described it. They thought in terms of moving towards resting points. And this is continuous. This is often missed in modern translations, because we like to think in our terms, and we say, well, the theorists back then would talk about moving towards a resting point in the key of 5, and they'd say, well, they're in the dominant key area, but that's our translation. They just talked about moving towards resting points. Just an example, if you would have a resting point leading towards a resting point over the harmony 5 of 5, what they might call Quintabsatz in der Tonart de Quinta. That phrase would be called a Quintabsatz in der Tonart de Quinta, Quintabsatz in 5, whether it started in the tonic key and modulated in its middle, or whether it started in the key of 5 and stayed there the whole time. Today we talk about a phrase that modulates in its middle and a phrase that stays in the key at the same key throughout. We'd give them completely different terms, but they didn't think that. They thought in terms of where you were leading to. And I should also mention that term I use, Quintabsatz, there's no translation to modern English. In my book, I really tried to avoid jargon, but I had to use some German words at times because there's no modern English equivalent, and there's no modern German equivalent for these either. You have a phrase that leads towards a resting point on 5, and the resting point itself is called the Quintabsatz, or a phrase that leads towards a resting point over a 1 chord, and that's supported by a keynote, what we call the tonic triad, and the resting point itself would be called the Grundabsatz. We don't think this way. People today try to translate the word Quintabsatz into half cadence, but it's not accurate. It's a passage that leads towards a resting point. And the analogy I make is if I were to visit you in Singapore, I would take a plane ride, let's say from New York to Paris, and then Paris to Singapore, let's say. So I'd say, well, I have 2 legs. I have the Paris leg and the Singapore leg. Now notice, I might be in the air for 10 hours from Paris to Singapore, but I still call that the Singapore leg.
Right.
Or I might spend 6 hours in the plane from New York to Paris, and I might be in the Paris airport only for 20 minutes, but I call that leg leading to Paris the Paris leg. The whole journey is thought of in terms of the goal point, and that if you can think that way, you can think of what the theorists of the 18th century were thinking about, not in terms of containers, motions to points.
That's brilliant, and that's so interesting. And actually, Pauni, let's also talk about key areas, so to speak, because that's really interesting to me, because I keep hearing in the 18th century, their conception of quote-unquote tonality is a little bit different from ours, and they modulated in very interesting ways. How was their conception of key areas different from the way we think about today?
Well, it was entirely different. Because they didn't have the notion of key areas in the modern sense. They struggled to describe what we call key area. Now, remember, the word area is a metaphor. It's like you have this container that contains this key. It's very helpful when you're talking about 19th century music, where you might start and end a passage in key and might stay there for 3 minutes. But in galant music, you're moving constantly. So they did not have this notion of key area in any sense in we did. And you'd see, so sometimes you look at the way they're describing it, the form, and you say, why are they talking about it in such an odd way? And maybe they could have had it learned from us, but it's too late. They're already dead. I'm much more interested not in what they could have learned from us, but what we could learn from them. I just said when a passage that begins and ends in the key of 5, Koch might say that you start with a modulation, a formal modulation to the key of 5. He wouldn't say you begin in the key area of 5. He said you start with a modulation because the key was ultimately confirmed only when you got to the end of the phrase.
Okay, wow, this is really so interesting. Can I ask you about how this relates to perhaps melody Now, in the Italian tradition, we know about their hexachordal solfeggio that they did for many years, and I've always suspected that melody in some way informs form. Do we think of form from the melody? Do we think of it from the bass? Do we think of it as big distances to resting points? How do we judge that distance between resting points?
The theorists, such as Koch and Riepel, talked about the form primarily in terms of the melody. But the melody would be supported by a harmony at its resting point. So when I might say, just in the summary, we're leading towards a resting point on one. I really mean the melody leads to a resting point, and it's supported by a harmony that might be a 1 or 5. And I should mention one thing that their attitude really promotes is sort of living in the moment. Whereas we might say you're in, what key area are you in, or what section of the form you are in, they were constantly thinking towards what goal am I moving.
Wow, this is so cool.
I know that you talk a lot about partimenti and improvisation in your show. I think this is very much in line with this notion that you're thinking in the moment. And where am I going to? And it's a different experience. And I find I listen to a lot of Galant music for the first time, just like people back then. I have Spotify. I listen to a Galant piece each time, and I'm just following it. I say, where might we be moving to next? And I'm not constantly thinking, what section am I in, which is often an impossible question to answer unless you study it. Sometimes you could take these pieces and study them for an hour and say, well, I've decided after careful analysis that the transition section begins here. But nobody listens to a play's music like that. They listen to music in real time. And I think by thinking about where you're moving to it's a great way to experience this music as it unfolds. In later music, you're looking at 19th century music to think, I am now in the first theme section, or I am in the transition zone, or I am in the second key area. That becomes much easier because the music is much broader then, and that metaphor becomes very helpful for later music. But in Galant music, it becomes too imposing, I find.